The terminal lounge was loud enough that nobody paid attention to the man in the corner, the one with the worn canvas jacket, the cold coffee, and the little girl drawing horses on a paper napkin beside him. Nobody paid attention to the boy at the next table, either hunched over an advanced workbook, his pencil completely stationary, his chin dropping lower with every passing minute. In an executive airfield bistro where corporate status was everything, they were entirely invisible. Nobody paid attention to any of it until the boy looked up, his eyes bright with unshed tears, and said the words that cut through the low hum of the room. Mom said no one would help me anymore. The man in the corner went still. He set down his cup. He looked at the boy, then he looked at his daughter, and he made a decision that would completely unravel the careful, quiet life he had spent 5 years trying to build. Sebastian Cole did not look like someone with an elite past to hide. That was precisely the point. He was 32 years old, lean, with dark eyes that moved with efficient vigilance across a room, and hands that stilled completely when he was deep in thought. He had the kind of face that was easy to overlook, just calm and unremarkable. The kind of calm that takes years to construct from something far more volatile underneath. People who hired him for executive transport or warehouse logistics thought he was just another quiet laborer. None of them thought to ask follow-up questions, which was exactly what he wanted. He managed a stable life for his 6-year-old daughter, Chloe. Chloe believed wholeheartedly that horses could talk if you listened closely enough. She had her father's dark eyes and her late mother's sudden, brilliant laugh. She drew constantly on napkins and receipts, completely unaware of why they moved so often, or why her father went entirely silent in the evenings. They came to this terminal bistro every Thursday after school, a reliable routine. Sebastian had noticed the boy, Oliver Bennett, almost immediately. It was the specific, crushing slump of a child who had been trying to understand something for too long and was running out of patience with himself. Oliver was 8 years old, wearing a crisp, collared shirt that suggested someone had dressed him with intense care. On the table in front of him lay a complex algorithmic mathematics packet from an elite preparatory academy. Oliver had transferred to a new school 11 days ago, and those 11 days had been the worst of his life. His old school was miles away, and everyone who knew his name had vanished overnight when adults made decisions he had no part in. Oliver had already approached an arrogant corporate executive at a nearby table for help. The man had sneered, telling him he didn't have time for remedial nonsense before turning back to his luxury phone. Oliver had returned to his table, pressing the heels of his hands against his eyes in that private, helpless gesture of a child trying not to cry in a public place. Sebastian watched from the corner. He told himself it wasn't his situation to solve. He had learned years ago the catastrophic cost of stepping into problems that weren't his. But looking at Oliver, he closed his laptop, picked up his coffee, walked over, and sat down across from him. "Which one is giving you trouble?" he asked quietly. Oliver lowered his hands, offering the binder cautiously. Sebastian looked at the problem. It took him exactly 4 seconds to map the entire data architecture. Pulling a worn tactical pen from his pocket, he didn't just give the answer. He explained it like a beautifully moving machine, breaking down the logic until Oliver's pencil started moving rapidly. "That's it?" Oliver asked, his eyes wide as he checked the correct answer. "That's it," Sebastian said, standing up to leave. That was when Oliver dropped the sentence that changed everything. "Mom said no one would help me anymore. She says we're on our own now." Sebastian sat back down, his expression hardening with intense focus. What did she mean by that? "We had to leave everything behind," Oliver whispered. "Nobody talks to me at the new school. I'm just invisible." Chloe walked over then, sliding a drawing of a black stallion in front of him. "You can have this one, Oliver. I'll draw you a wolf next." A sudden shift occurred in the room. The heavy glass doors of the lounge slid open, and the ambient chatter completely died. A woman stepped inside, surrounded by an atmosphere of absolute authority. Amelia Carter, the brilliant, notoriously cold CEO of a massive aerospace tech firm, scanned the room, her eyes locked onto Sebastian sitting with her son, and her expression instantly rearranged into a mask of pure corporate steel as she marched directly toward their table. Amelia Carter's heels clicked sharply against the polished terrazzo floor. "Oliver, step away from the table," she commanded, her voice low but carrying an unmistakable authority that caused the nearby bistro barista to freeze mid-motion. Her eyes, cold and sharp as shards of obsidian, locked directly onto Sebastian. She was a woman used to commanding rooms filled with 100 board members, and here, wrapped in a tailored wool coat and holding a state-of-the-art encrypted phone, she looked entirely out of place, yet completely dominant. Sebastian did not flinch. He did not quickly stand up or offer a defensive apology, the way most men did when caught under her icy glare. Instead, he simply set his tactical pen down with a slow, deliberate calmness that instantly threw Amelia off balance. "Mom, stop, please," Oliver pleaded, his voice cracking as he held up the advanced workbook. "He didn't do anything wrong. He actually helped me. Look at the problems. I finally understand them." Amelia snatched the binder, her eyes scanning the pages. She expected to see messy scrawls or incorrect formulas from a random stranger trying to pass the time. Instead, her breath caught slightly in her throat. The equations weren't just answered. They were laid out with an elegant, flawless architecture. The logical proofs were broken down using a unique, highly advanced formatting method, one she had only ever seen utilized by top-tier systems analysts in elite aerospace programs. She looked back at Sebastian, her gaze narrowing with intense suspicion. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice dropping an octave, losing some of its corporate polish and exposing a raw, defensive edge. Tutors from the Horizon Academy couldn't get Oliver to comprehend this data structure. "How did you do this?" "It's just math," Sebastian replied smoothly, his voice a striking contrast to her high-strung energy. It was deep, grounded, and carried the quiet masculinity of a man who had absolutely nothing to prove to anyone. The boy was stuck. People shouldn't be left stuck when the answer is right there. Amelia felt a strange, unfamiliar tremor of vulnerability pass through her. For months, since their sudden relocation and her taking the helm of Omniflight Systems, she had been drowning in corporate warfare and the crushing isolation of being a single mother. She had all the wealth in the world, yet she couldn't buy her son peace, stability, or clarity. And here was this man, dressed in a faded canvas jacket, providing absolute safety and understanding to her son without even trying. "I don't appreciate strangers profiling my family or my son's academic struggles," Amelia said, attempting to rebuild her icy wall of defense. She pulled out a pristine, heavy stock business card and slid it across the table with a practiced, dismissive flick of her wrist. "Name your price for the time you wasted. I don't like being in anyone's debt." Sebastian looked down at the card. It read, "Amelia Carter, Chief Executive Officer, Omniflight Systems." He didn't pick it up. He didn't look impressed. He just looked at her with a quiet, penetrating gaze that seemed to read right through her expensive exterior, straight to the exhausted, terrified mother underneath. "Keep your money, Miss Carter," Sebastian said softly. "I drive executive ride shares and work warehouse logistics down at the industrial harbor. I don't charge for helping a child." Amelia's mind raced. A rideshare driver? A warehouse worker? It made absolutely no sense. The data notation on Oliver's paper was too precise, too elite. Before she could push further, Chloe leaned over the table, tugging gently on Amelia's tailored sleeve. "Don't worry, lady," Chloe said, her wide, dark eyes filled with absolute, pure warmth. "My daddy can fix anything. He fixed my broken toy airplane yesterday and he made it fly higher than the trees." Amelia looked down at the little girl, her breath catching again. The sheer emotional security radiating from this small family was staggering. She looked at Sebastian's hands, rough, calloused, but perfectly steady. Suspicion flared intensely within her. No ordinary laborer possessed that specific type of calm authority, nor did they use tactical-grade instrument pens. Suddenly, Amelia's phone vibrated violently in her hand. A red alert flashed across the encrypted screen, bypassing all silent protocols. It was a catastrophic systems telemetry failure from their primary flight testing hangar at the Sterling International Airfield. Her lead engineer's voice text popped up on the display. "The primary propulsion node is collapsing. Total system lockdown in 30 minutes. We don't know why." Amelia's face went completely pale. The cold, controlled CEO vanished, replaced by a terrified woman on the verge of losing everything she had built. She stared at the cascading lines of failing code displayed on her screen, completely helpless under the pressure. Sebastian glanced at the reflection of the screen on the polished table, his eyes locking onto a very specific sequence of numbers. His posture shifted instantly, transitioning into a rigid, commanding stillness that radiated military precision. "Miss Carter," Sebastian said, his voice dropping into a low, authoritative register that demanded absolute obedience. "Your balancing parameters are inverted." Amelia Carter stared at the man before her, her hand freezing over her flashing smartphone. "What did you just say?" she whispered. Her voice carried a sudden, dangerous sharpness, masking the sudden tremor of panic that threatened to shatter her perfectly cultivated professional exterior. Before Sebastian could reply, her phone erupted into a loud, jarring ringtone that bypassed all silent protocols. It was a high-priority encrypted video transmission from the main testing facility at Sterling International Airfield. Amelia swiped the screen with a trembling finger and held it up. The screen filled with the chaotic, sweat-sheened face of Harrison Vance, the Chief Operational Engineer of OmniFlight Systems. In the background, heavy red emergency strobes were pulsing against the metal framework of a massive hangar, and the shrill, terrifying wail of structural alarms cut through the speaker, filling the quiet airfield bistro. Miss Carter, we have a catastrophic thermal runaway in the primary propulsion node of the Vanguard prototype. Vance shouted over the din, his eyes wide with absolute terror. The automated stabilization unit is completely locked up. The internal core pressure is climbing exponentially. If we can't force a manual electronic bypass in the next 20 minutes, the entire platform is going to suffer an irrecoverable structural failure. The board of directors is already demanding answers on line 2. Amelia's corporate composure fractured completely right there in front of the entire room. She leaned forward, her face turning pale, her voice rising in a desperate attempt to command a situation she clearly did not understand. Authorize a hard reset immediately, Harrison. Pull the primary breaker. Cut the fuel feeds manually. We tried. Vance screamed back, slamming his hand against a diagnostic console on screen. The safety overrides are completely ignoring our commands. The central flight computer is trapped. It thinks it's currently mid-flight at 40,000 feet. It absolutely will not allow us to cut power while it thinks it's airborne. The public lounge went completely dead silent. Several high-profile airport executives and corporate travelers at neighboring tables turned around, staring openly at the unfolding corporate disaster. Beside her, little Oliver Bennett watched his mother's face drain of color. Seeing the absolute raw terror in the eyes of the woman who was supposed to protect him, the boy's chest began to heave. He dropped his pencil, his hands shaking violently as tears spilled over his cheeks. The sheer weight of his mother's panic was crushing him. Sebastian did not look at the screaming phone. He did not look at the staring crowd. His eyes went straight to the terrified child. Moving with a smooth, deliberate grace, Sebastian reached across the space between their tables and placed a large, calloused, reassuring hand firmly on Oliver's trembling shoulder. He squeezed gently, grounding the boy instantly. "Oliver, look at me," Sebastian said. His voice was a perfect, unwavering anchor of safety, completely devoid of fear, radiating a quiet, masculine strength that filled the immediate space. "Take a deep breath, buddy. Your mom is just doing her job, and everything is going to be completely fine. I promise you. Look at my eyes. You are safe." Oliver looked up, his tear-filled gaze locking into Sebastian's calm, steady, dark eyes. In an instant, the boy's hyperventilating slowed. The chaotic noise of the world seemed to fade into the background. He took a deep, shaky breath and nodded, wiping his face. Beside him, Chloe smiled warmly, tapping Oliver's arm. "See? I told you. My daddy knows how to fix the big loud things too. He's never scared." Amelia witnessed the entire interaction, and a profound, aching realization hit her right in the chest. She had millions of dollars in the bank, absolute power over a massive tech empire, and dozens of elite employees at her beck and call. Yet, in the moment of true crisis, she was emotionally helpless, unable to even comfort her own son. And here was this humble, rideshare driver, a man she had just tried to dismiss with a cold business card, providing absolute emotional security to her child without even trying. Sebastian turned his gaze from Oliver back to Amelia. Without asking for permission, he reached out and firmly took the vibrating phone from her hand. He held it up, his eyes instantly tracking the cascading lines of red error logs scrolling past the video feed. "Vance," Sebastian said directly into the microphone. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried an undeniable, chilling authority that instantly cut through the blaring alarms on the other end of the line. The chief engineer stopped shouting, blinking at the screen in confusion. "Who is this? Is this airport security? Get off this line. We are in a Class A emergency." "Listen to me very carefully and stop yelling," Sebastian commanded, his tone dropping into a tight, military, precise rhythm. "The flight computer isn't ignoring your commands. It's trapped in a recursive diagnostic loop because your ground test telemetry is feeding the primary sensor array an inverted velocity variable. The system thinks it's stalling at terminal velocity. Stop trying to cut the power. You are making the loop tighter. An absolute silence fell over the video call. Harrison Vance's jaw dropped open as he stared at the stranger on his screen. How? How could you possibly know that? That's proprietary code. Who are you? You have exactly 17 minutes before the thermal couplers melt and ruin the asset, Sebastian continued, ignoring the question entirely. Disconnect the primary data bus. Feed a simulated airspeed pressure metric into the secondary intake valve to trick the computer into thinking the aircraft has touched down. Only then will your master manual bypass engage. Do it now. Amelia sat frozen, her breath caught in her throat. The hidden clues were staring her right in the face. This man wasn't just smart. He was speaking the highly classified, deeply complex structural language of advanced aerospace engineering. Vance stammers over the speaker, his voice filled with sudden awe. That's a legacy defensive override protocol from the old military aerospace blueprints. That's not even in our current operational manual. How do you know that? Sebastian didn't answer. He calmly flipped the phone face down and slid it back across the table to Amelia. You need to get to your hangar, Miss Carter. Your son needs to see you calm, and your engineers need to execute that override before they destroy your company. Amelia gripped the phone, her hands still shaking, but a desperate, intense spark of hope ignited in her eyes. She looked at her son, who was now sitting quietly, completely safe under Sebastian's watchful gaze. She made a sudden, impulsive executive decision. Come with me, she whispered, her voice losing its coldness, exposed and vulnerable. Please. If my team scrambles the input, the entire prototype is lost. I'll pay you whatever you want. Just get in my vehicle. Sebastian looked down at Chloe, then back at Amelia's pleading eyes. He saw a mother desperate to save the future she was building for her son. He let out a soft sigh and stood up, buttoning his canvas jacket. I don't want your money, Miss Carter, but I'll help you save your aircraft. They rushed out of the bistro, moving quickly through the terminal toward her waiting luxury SUV. Sebastian carried a sleepy Chloe in his arms while Amelia held Oliver's hand tightly. Within minutes, the SUV was speeding down the perimeter road toward the heavily secured corporate hangars of the airfield. But as they pulled up to the main security checkpoint, a massive, gleaming black armored sedan violently cut directly across their path, blocking the electronic gates entirely. The doors flung open, and a tall, arrogant man in a flawless three-piece European suit stepped out, flanked by two burly private security guards. He adjusted his silk tie and looked directly through the windshield at Amelia with a predatory, mocking smile. Amelia slammed her foot onto the brake pedal. The luxury SUV shrieked to a violent halt, its bumper stopping mere inches from the glossy flank of the black armored sedan. Through the windshield, the glare of the security floodlights illuminated the man stepping out of the vehicle. Trenton Cross, the ruthless majority stakeholder of Zenith Capital and Amelia's fiercest rival on the OmniFlight board of directors, smoothed the lapels of his tailored suit. He walked toward her window with the slow, predatory confidence of a man who knew he held every single card. Behind him, two burly private security guards stood at absolute attention, their hands resting ominously close to their holsters. Amelia rolled down her window, her knuckles turning white on the steering wheel. Trenton, move your vehicle right now, she commanded, trying desperately to summon her usual icy authority, but the subtle tremor in her voice betrayed her. We have a catastrophic thermal runaway in the primary hangar. The Vanguard prototype is going to burn if I don't get through that gate. Trenton leaned his arm against her doorframe, looking down at her with a sickening, patronizing smirk. Oh, I know all about the Vanguard, Amelia, he drawled, his voice dripping with condescending satisfaction. In fact, the entire board knows, which is why, exactly 4 minutes ago, we enacted an emergency operational freeze. Your security credentials have been revoked. You no longer have access to this airfield or to OmniFlight systems. Amelia's breath left her in a sudden, painful gasp. You can't do that. The company is mine. I built it. You used to run it, Trenton corrected sharply, his eyes flashing with a cold corporate malice. But under your brilliant leadership, our billion-dollar asset is currently melting into a pile of scrap metal. I've already initiated a forced corporate buyout. By midnight, Zenith Capital will own every patent, every hangar, and every piece of intellectual property you possess. You are done, Amelia. Go home and find a hobby. Amelia sat entirely paralyzed, the crushing weight of total defeat settling over her shoulders. The tech empire she had sacrificed her entire life to build, the future she was securing for her son, was being ripped away in a single public ambush. She felt completely, utterly helpless. In the back seat, the aggressive volume of Trenton's voice triggered an immediate reaction. Oliver curled into a tight ball against the leather seat, his hands covering his ears as tears streamed down his face. "Mom, please make him stop." The boy choked out, his chest heaving in a severe panic attack. "Please, Mom, let's just go." Amelia turned around, her heart breaking, completely powerless to calm her child while her own world was collapsing around her. Trenton glanced past Amelia, his arrogant gaze sweeping across the interior of the SUV. His eyes landed on Sebastian, who sat in the front passenger seat, dressed in his faded canvas jacket, completely still and unbothered. Trenton let out a loud, mocking laugh. "Good God, Amelia, it's worse than I thought." Trenton sneered, pointing a dismissive finger directly at Sebastian. "Is this what you're resorting to now? Dragging a low-class rideshare driver or a grease monkey from the harbor into a secure military-grade testing facility? What did you do, hire him out of the gutter to help pack up your office?" He looked at the security guards at the gate and shouted loudly, ensuring the gathering crowd of airfield staff could hear every word. "Hey, make sure this pathetic loser doesn't touch anything expensive on his way out. He looks like he'd steal the copper wiring right out of the walls." Amelia closed her eyes, the humiliation burning deep in her chest. She had dragged an innocent man, a humble father who had done nothing but show her son kindness, into the middle of her ruthless corporate execution. Sebastian didn't move. He didn't yell, he didn't ball his fists. But underneath his calm exterior, his dark eyes shifted, locking onto the electronic countdown clock mounted on the external wall of the security kiosk. 11 minutes left. Moving with an unhurried, quiet masculinity, Sebastian unbuckled his seatbelt. He turned to the back seat, placing his hand gently over Oliver's trembling arm. The moment his calloused hand touched the boy, Oliver's sobbing slowed. "Chloe," Sebastian said softly, his voice an unshakable anchor in the middle of the storm. "Keep an eye on Oliver for a second. Daddy needs to go fix a gate." "Okay, Daddy," Chloe said confidently, hugging her drawing binder tightly. Sebastian opened the passenger door and stepped out into the chilly night air. The moment his boots hit the asphalt, his entire aura transformed. The casual slump of a rideshare driver vanished, replaced by a rigid, terrifyingly dominant military bearing. He walked directly toward Trenton Cross. "Hey, get back in the vehicle, peasant," Trenton snapped, totally insulted that a common laborer was approaching him. "You don't speak to me. You don't even look at me." Sebastian stopped exactly 1 inch from Trenton's face. He was broader, taller, and possessed the chilling, quiet strength of a man who had survived things Trenton couldn't even begin to comprehend in his comfortable boardrooms. "Move your car, Mr. Cross," Sebastian said. His voice was dangerously low, vibrating with an unyielding authority that made the two security guards instantly take a step back, their instincts screaming that they were dealing with someone incredibly dangerous. "Are you threatening me?" Trenton stuttered, his arrogance suddenly faltering under Sebastian's intense, penetrating gaze. "I'll have you thrown in a federal prison. You are nobody." Sebastian didn't waste another second on him. He bypassed Trenton entirely and walked up to the main security gate's encrypted biometric terminal, a highly restricted, military-grade OmniSec command interface that required a 5-level deep defense clearance to operate. "Get away from that console," Trenton yelled, recovering his arrogance as he rushed after him. "That's a classified government encrypted system. It's completely locked down by board command." "You can't bypass that with a hammer, you idiot." Sebastian ignored the shouting entirely. He stared at the glowing blue interface, his calloused fingers hovering over the keypad. He didn't look at a cheat sheet. He didn't guess. With blinding speed and flawless precision, his fingers flew across the secure layout, entering a standard 24-digit alphanumeric override command, a deeply classified legacy master sequence that only 3 people in the entire United States military apparatus possessed. The terminal flashed. The red lockdown light violently snapped to a vibrant, solid green. A heavy electronic chime echoed across the concrete courtyard, and the massive, armored steel security gates began to screech open, retreating into the walls. Trenton Cross froze, tracking the movement, his jaw dropping so low it looked as if it might unhinge entirely. He stared at the open gate, then at the glowing screen, his face completely draining of color. How? How did a garbage driver just override a level 5 military encryption block? He whispered, his voice trembling with sudden, absolute terror. Sebastian turned around slowly, his face an unreadable mask of pure, stone-cold authority. He didn't say a single word. He simply walked back to Amelia's SUV, climbed into the passenger seat, and closed the door. He looked at Amelia, whose eyes were wide with a mixture of shock and sheer awe. "Drive, Miss Carter," Sebastian said calmly. "We have 9 minutes left." Amelia slammed her foot onto the accelerator, and the luxury SUV surged through the opening steel gates, leaving Trenton Cross and his security detail standing in a cloud of exhaust and shattered arrogance. The vehicle tore down the restricted taxiway toward Hangar 7, the massive structure bathed in the harsh, rotating amber glow of emergency beacons. Inside the cabin, the silence was thick, broken only by the ragged breathing of Oliver in the back seat. Amelia gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles cracked. She kept stealing glances at Sebastian in the passenger seat. He sat perfectly relaxed, staring out at the approaching hangar as if he were taking a routine Sunday drive, his quiet masculinity acting as a strange pressure valve for the immense tension suffocating the car. "How did you do that?" Amelia finally whispered, her voice trembling as she steered around a parked fuel truck. "That override, that wasn't just a standard security bypass. That was an Alpha-tier Department of Defense encryption key. Only a handful of high-ranking military officials and the original system designers have access to that layer of the mainframe. Who are you, Sebastian?" Sebastian didn't turn his head. He kept his eyes locked on the smoking exhaust vents of Hangar 7. "Right now, I'm the guy helping you keep your company," he said softly, his voice level and entirely unhurried. "We have less than 6 minutes before the internal thermal couplers reach the point of no return. Focus on the entrance." Amelia swerved the SUV to a halt outside the small access door of the hangar. The moment the engine cut, the sheer volume of the disaster hit them. Even through the insulated walls of the building, a deep, terrifying, high-pitched mechanical shriek vibrated through the air, the sound of a multi-billion-dollar aerospace engine tearing itself apart from the inside out. The interior of the hangar was absolute chaos. Acrid white smoke hung heavy in the air, smelling of burning synthetic polymers and superheated titanium. Dozens of technicians and engineers in high-visibility vests were running in circles, shouting over the deafening roar of the alarms. In the center of the facility, mounted on a massive hydraulic test platform, sat the Vanguard prototype. It was a sleek, black masterpiece of next-generation aviation engineering, but right now, its primary engine cowling was glowing a dangerous, angry cherry red. Harrison Vance was at the main control console, sweat pouring down his face as he slammed his fists onto a keyboard. "It's not responding!" "The emergency suppression system is completely locked out," he screamed to no one in particular. Amelia rushed into the room, her corporate defenses crumbling entirely. The absolute power she held in the boardroom meant nothing here. Faced with raw, volatile mechanical failure, she felt completely helpless. She panicked, her voice pitching high as she grabbed Vance by the shoulder. "Harrison! Shut it down! Find a way to cut the main fuel lines manually!" "We cannot lose this aircraft. We can't get close enough to the manual valves, Miss Carter," Vance yelled back, his eyes wide with defeat. "The ambient heat near the core is already pushing past 400 degrees. If we step onto that platform, the thermal blast will kill us. It's over. We have to evacuate the building before the secondary fuel cell ignites." Hearing the word ignite, little Oliver let out a terrified sob. The deafening alarms, the thick smoke, and the sheer panic radiating from his mother completely overwhelmed him. He fell to his knees on the concrete floor, curling into a ball, covering his ears as he hyperventilated. Amelia turned and saw her son collapsing into fear. She dropped to her knees beside him, her hands shaking violently as she tried to pull him to her chest. "Oliver, please, baby, look at Mom." "It's okay, it's going to be okay," she cried, but her own voice was so thin, so laced with terror, that it only made the boy panic more. She couldn't calm him. In the face of real danger, her wealth and status were useless tools. Then, a heavy, warm presence settled beside them. Sebastian knelt on the concrete. Without a trace of fear or urgency, he slipped his faded canvas jacket off his shoulders and gently wrapped it completely around Oliver, muffling the terrifying sounds of the hangar. He didn't pull the boy away. Instead, he simply laid a massive, steady hand on the small of Oliver's back, leaning in close so the boy could hear him clearly over the din. "Oliver," Sebastian said. His voice was a perfect, unyielding shield of safety. It was deep, completely grounded, and filled with a quiet, masculine strength that demanded trust. "Listen to the sound of my voice, buddy. Look at me. I told you outside that you were safe, and I don't break my promises. I am right here. My daughter Chloe is standing right next to you. Nothing is going to happen to you." Oliver slowly opened his eyes, looking out from beneath the canvas jacket. He looked into Sebastian's dark, completely still eyes. The absolute absence of panic in the man was infectious. Within seconds, Oliver's breathing began to slow. The chaotic terror of the room seemed to shatter against Sebastian's unshakable calm. Oliver took a deep, shuddering breath and nodded, gripping the edge of Sebastian's sleeve. Sebastian offered a brief, warm smile, then stood up. He looked at Chloe, who was standing perfectly still, holding her drawing binder to her chest. "Chloe, stay right here with Oliver. Hold his hand." "I got him, Daddy," Chloe said bravely, stepping forward to take Oliver's hand beneath the jacket. Sebastian turned around and faced the burning aircraft. The casual, quiet father vanished completely. His shoulders squared, his posture locked into a rigid, commanding military bearing, and an aura of pure, elite authority radiated from him. He walked directly toward the primary engineering console, pushing past two panicked technicians without even looking at them. "Hey, get back to the evacuation zone," Harrison Vance shouted as Sebastian approached. "You can't be up here." Sebastian didn't waste a single breath arguing. He grabbed Vance by the collar of his vest and firmly guided him out of the main chair, stepping into the command position. His calloused hands hovered over the complex, multi-screen interface for a fraction of a second. He didn't read the warning messages. He didn't check the manuals. His fingers began to strike the keyboard with a blinding, rhythmic speed that stunned the remaining engineers into absolute silence. He was typing in deep system command strings, bypassing the standard graphical user interface entirely, and coding directly into the core operating system of the aircraft. "What is he doing?" Amelia whispered, standing up from the floor, her breath catching in her throat as she watched the rideshare driver completely dominate her engineering command center. The cascading red warning screen suddenly paused. Sebastian reached up, his hand locking onto the primary communication headset. He toggled the master channel, his voice echoing across the hangar's loudspeaker system with absolute, chilling precision. Mainframe logic override initiated. Simulating airspeed pressure at 300 knots. Forcing automated touchdown sequence in 3, 2, 1. He slammed his palm onto the master execute key. The shriek of the engine instantly changed pitch, dropping from a terrifying scream to a low, heavy rumble. The cherry red glow on the cowling began to visibly fade as the flight computer, finally tricked into believing the aircraft was safely on the ground, unlocked the emergency cooling valves. A massive cloud of white steam vented safely out of the roof exhaust, and the structural alarms violently snapped off, plunging the massive hangar into a sudden, staggering silence. Harrison Vance stared at the diagnostic monitors, his mouth hanging open, his clipboard slipping from his hands and clattering against the floor. "The core pressure is stabilizing," Vance whispered, his voice cracking with absolute disbelief. He bypassed the airborne safety lock from a ground terminal. That's impossible. Nobody knows that structural sequence except. Vance slowly turned his head, staring at Sebastian's profile with a look of sudden, overwhelming shock as a realization hit him like a physical blow. Except the man who engineered the initial blueprint. "Oh my God. You're him." Harrison Vance stood completely frozen, his eyes wide as he looked at the man in the faded canvas jacket. The hangar had gone so quiet that the slow dripping of cooled synthetic fluid from the emergency safety valves sounded like a ticking clock against the concrete floor. "You are Sebastian Cole," Vance said, his voice dropping into a breathless, reverent whisper that carried clearly across the silent command center. "The Sebastian Cole. The ghost architect who designed the entire Aegis flight telemetry framework for the Defense Department before you vanished 5 years ago. You didn't just write the diagnostic override for the Vanguard prototype. You built the entire foundation of modern aerospace technology." The whispered words rippled through the gathered crowd of technicians and senior software engineers. A low, collective gasp echoed through the facility. These were elite professionals, men and women who had spent their entire careers studying Cole's foundational architecture in restricted technical journals and high-level defense seminars, treating his vanished genius like a modern myth. To discover that the myth was standing right in front of them, dressed in a worn jacket, operating a ground terminal with flawless, casual precision, was completely staggering. Amelia Carter took a slow, hesitant step forward, her heart hammering violently against her ribs. She looked at Sebastian, then at the terminal screen displaying the perfectly stabilized core parameters, and finally at the paper napkin she had tightly clutched in her coat pocket from the bistro. The elegant, compact notation. The absolute unshakable stillness under intense pressure. The unmatched understanding of a system that had baffled her entire high-salaried senior staff for 6 grueling weeks. It all clicked together with a terrifying, beautiful clarity. "It was you," Amelia whispered, her voice completely stripped of its corporate armor, exposing a deep, profound vulnerability. "The anonymized consulting bridge 5 years ago. The legacy files that kept my company afloat when we had nothing. You didn't just stumble onto the answer in the cafe, Sebastian. You built the very world we are all living in." Sebastian didn't look triumphant. He didn't boast, and he didn't look around for approval. He simply removed the communication headset, placing it gently on the console, his quiet masculinity completely dominating the massive room. "I built a machine, Miss Carter," he said softly, his dark eyes meeting her gaze with absolute honesty and warmth. "But machines can always be rebuilt. People are what matter." Before Amelia could respond, the heavy, reinforced steel security doors of the hangar were violently thrown open, slamming against the concrete walls. Trenton Cross strode into the facility, flanked by his personal corporate attorneys and 2 large security guards. He was holding a leather-bound folder, a vicious, victorious smile plastered across his face. "All right, clear the floor," Trenton shouted, his voice echoing arrogantly off the metal beams of the ceiling. "The 20 minutes are officially up. The Vanguard asset is a total loss, and Zenith Capital is executing the emergency corporate takeover clause immediately. Amelia, sign the transition documents right now, or my security detail will escort you and your pathetic street trash driver off this airfield in handcuffs." Trenton marched toward the command center, fully expecting to see a ruined, smoking prototype and a weeping, broken female executive. Instead, he stopped dead in his tracks. The Vanguard prototype sat perfectly silent on its hydraulic platform, its cherry red glow entirely gone, cooled to a safe, stable resting temperature. The diagnostic monitors were glowing a solid, vibrant green, displaying flawless system health. But more shocking to Trenton was the atmosphere in the room. None of the 60 engineers were packing their bags. None of them were looking at him with fear. Every single person in the hangar was standing in a tight, protective circle around Sebastian Cole, their faces hardened with absolute disdain for the billionaire investor. What is the meaning of this? What is the meaning of this? Trenton stammered, his arrogance suddenly faltering as he looked around the silent, unmoving crowd. "Harrison, why aren't the evacuation alarms going off? Why isn't the aircraft destroyed?" Harrison Vance stepped forward, his posture straight and confident, completely ignoring the man who held a multi-billion-dollar investment portfolio. "The aircraft is completely safe, Mr. Cross," Vance said, his voice ringing with absolute pride. "And your hostile takeover is completely invalid." "Invalid?" Trenton screeched, his face twisting into an ugly, furious mask as he stepped closer. "I own the majority stake of the debt. I own the board. I don't care if the plane didn't burn. I'm removing Amelia Carter tonight, and I will personally throw this garbage mechanic into a federal holding cell for trespassing on a military-grade site." Sebastian took a single step forward, moving past the protective line of engineers. The moment he stepped into the light, Trenton's personal security guards instantly froze. They recognized the rigid, uncompromising military posture. They recognized the chilling, absolute lack of fear in his eyes. Their professional instincts told them that if they reached for their weapons, they would not survive the encounter. "You won't be throwing anyone anywhere, Mr. Cross," Sebastian said. His voice wasn't loud, but it possessed a terrifying heavy weight that instantly suffocated Trenton's shouting. Sebastian reached into his pocket, pulled out his worn leather wallet, and extracted a small, solid titanium identification card that he rarely ever looked at. He walked forward and placed it flat on the console directly in front of Trenton. "Look at the underwriting of your Zenith Capital investment bond, Trenton," Sebastian continued, his voice perfectly level, radiating a cold, supreme authority. 5 years ago, when the Meridian Framework was implemented, a sovereign blind trust was established to fund the secondary operational capital for Omniflight systems. That trust holds a non-dilutable 51% supervoting share over the entire airfield infrastructure, including your bonds. Trenton stared down at the titanium card. It bore the golden crest of the Department of Defense Special Architecture Command, stamped with a unique, high-clearance signature code, Cole, S. Chief Systems Director, Sovereign Trustee. Trenton's breath caught in his throat. He shook his head violently, his hands beginning to tremble as he backed away from the console, looking from the card to the man in the faded jacket. No, that's impossible. The Sovereign Trustee is a ghost, a multi-billionaire military legend who completely walked away from the global tech sector. You're just a rideshare driver. You're a nobody. I drive a car because I enjoy taking my daughter to school, Mr. Cross, Sebastian said, his voice entirely unbothered by the billionaire's panic. But I still own the ground you are currently standing on. Harrison, lock down the facility. Revoke Mr. Cross's access credentials immediately and have airfield security remove him from my hangar. An absolute explosion of cheers and applause erupted from the 60 engineers in the room. The public reversal was total. Trenton Cross stood entirely humiliated, his face turning a deep, embarrassed purple as his own personal security guards, recognizing the supreme legal and military authority of the Sovereign Trustee, gently but firmly gripped his arms, turning him around and marching him out into the cold night air. Amelia watched the entire scene play out, her hands shaking, tears of immense relief finally spilling over her cheeks. She looked at the man who had just saved her life, her company, and her son's entire future. Sebastian turned back to the console, the intense military aura instantly softening as he looked over at the bench where the children were waiting. Oliver was sitting up under the canvas jacket, completely calm, holding Chloe's hand with a small, genuine smile on his face. Sebastian walked over, kneeling in front of them, completely unbothered by the fact that he had just dismantled a billionaire's empire. "All right, kids," Sebastian said gently, his warm, grounded voice returning completely. "The big, loud machine is all fixed. Who's ready to go home?" The roaring chaos of Hangar 7 subsided into a profound, heavy silence as Harrison Vance quietly gestured for the remaining technicians and engineers to clear the main floor. They moved away with practiced efficiency, leaving the core of the command center empty, save for the two families. The stark, overhead industrial floodlights cast long, dramatic shadows across the polished concrete, illuminating the sleek, black frame of the now safe Vanguard prototype. Amelia Carter stood completely still by the primary console. The formidable, untouchable CEO who had spent years intimidating boards of directors and surviving ruthless corporate warfare seemed to have vanished entirely. In her place was a woman trembling from the sheer, overwhelming weight of sudden relief. The realization of what had just happened was staggering. Her company was saved, her rival was dismantled, and her son was sitting quietly, completely safe from the panic that had threatened to tear his world apart. She looked at Sebastian. He was leaning against the edge of a heavy equipment workbench, completely unbothered by the gravity of his own revelation. He hadn't changed into a different person. He was still the same man from the airfield bistro, wearing his worn canvas jacket, his dark eyes calm and entirely grounded. The contrast was mesmerizing. She had spent her entire adult life believing that power was built on money, status, and control. Yet this man possessed a supreme, unshakable authority that money could never buy. He gave safety without even trying. Amelia took a slow, hesitant step toward him, her hands still trembling slightly as she wrapped her coat tighter around herself. "Harrison said you vanished 5 years ago," she said, her voice dropping into a low, vulnerable whisper that felt entirely rare and genuine. "He said the entire industry searched for you. They thought you were a ghost, Sebastian." Sebastian looked over at her, his face softening with that quiet, masculine warmth that had anchored her son hours earlier. "I wasn't a ghost, Miss Carter," he said softly. "I was just a father. The world I left behind was full of people fighting for things that don't last. When my wife died, and I held Chloe for the first time alone, I realized that the only architecture that mattered was the one that kept her safe, happy, and loved. The rest of it was just noise." Amelia looked down at her shoes, a sudden, heavy wave of emotion hitting her chest. "I've been running so fast for so long," she whispered, her throat tightening. "Ever since Oliver's father left, I thought the only way to protect my son was to build a fortress of wealth around him. I thought if I was powerful enough, nobody could ever hurt us again. But tonight, when that machine started failing, and when Trenton blocked that gate, I realized I had everything. I had millions of dollars, a tech empire, a brilliant staff, and I was completely, utterly helpless. I couldn't even stop my own son from crying. Sebastian stood up from the workbench, walking over to stand exactly a foot away from her. He didn't reach out to touch her, respecting her space, but his presence alone felt like an unyielding shield against the cold night air. "You aren't helpless, Amelia," Sebastian said, using her first name for the very first time. His voice was a perfect, steady anchor. "You're a mother who was willing to drive through a closed gate to save the future you built for your son. There's nothing helpless about that. You were just fighting the wrong variables. You don't need a fortress to keep Oliver safe. He just needs to know that when the world gets too loud, his mother is there, standing steady." Amelia looked up, her eyes locking into his steady, dark gaze. For the first time in 5 years, the internal panic that had driven her every waking hour seemed to fall away. The realization hit her with a profound, quiet intensity. She has everything, except peace. And this man carries peace within him effortlessly. A soft sound from the corner broke the silence. Oliver had stood up from the bench, still wrapped in Sebastian's oversized canvas jacket. He walked over to his mother, his face clean of tears, his eyes bright and steady. He didn't look at her with fear anymore. He looked at her with a deep, newfound pride. "Mom," Oliver said quietly, tugging on her coat. "Are we going to be okay now?" Amelia dropped to her knees, pulling her son into a tight, desperate embrace, burying her face in his hair. "Yes, baby," she choked out, the tears finally flowing freely, but this time they were tears of absolute release. "We are going to be completely okay. I promise you." Oliver pulled back slightly, looking over her shoulder at Sebastian, the boy's face filled with absolute, pure hero worship. Mr. Sebastian fixed the plane, Mom. He knew exactly what to type. He's like a superhero. Sebastian smiled, kneeling down so he was at eye level with the boy. "No superheroes here, Oliver," he said, his voice warm and natural. "Just a dad who knows how to read a map. You did a great job tonight, buddy. You stayed brave when things got loud. That takes real strength." Oliver beamed, his posture straightening as he absorbed the praise from the man he now admired above anyone else. Behind him, Chloe walked over, her drawing binder tucked under her arm. She tapped Oliver on the shoulder. "I told you my daddy could do it. Now come on, you still have to finish drawing the legs on that wolf." The two children walked back toward the bench, the heavy atmosphere of the corporate crisis completely forgotten as they returned to their innocent world of crayons and paper napkins. Amelia stood up slowly, wiping her face, a beautiful, rare smile breaking through her exhaustion as she watched her son laugh with Chloe. It was the first time she had seen him laugh like that in months. She turned back to Sebastian, the subtle, romantic, and emotional tension stretching between them in the quiet hangar, built entirely on mutual respect and an unspoken understanding of what it meant to carry the weight of a child's world alone. "I know you said you left this world deliberately," Amelia said, her voice steadying as she looked at him with a deep, unwavering respect. "And I know you don't want or need my money. But Omni Flight Systems needs a soul, Sebastian. My engineers need a leader who remembers why we build these things in the first place. And I think Oliver and I need someone who knows how to stop and sit down when the world gets too fast." She paused, her breath catching as she waited for his response. "I want you to come to Bridgepoint, our core architecture division, on your terms, your hours, your conditions. No corporate politics, no boardrooms. Just you, your daughter, and the freedom to build what matters." Sebastian looked at the glowing green monitors of the Vanguard, then at his daughter Chloe, who was currently showing Oliver the proper way to shade a wolf's ears. He let out a slow, quiet breath, his mind turning over the decision. Before he could answer, the heavy glass doors of the command deck clicked open, and Harrison Vance stepped back into the room, holding an encrypted tablet that was flashing with an urgent, amber notification sequence. "Miss Carter, Chief Cole," Vance said, his voice tight with a sudden, unexpected gravity. "We have a secondary situation. The Pentagon just tracked the encryption override used on our gate. They've initiated an emergency high-clearance trace, and a military transport helicopter from the Andrews Aerospace Command just entered our airspace. They know the architect has resurfaced." The deep, structural vibration of a twin-rotor military transport helicopter rattled the high windows of Hangar 7. The searchlights from the massive aircraft swept across the tarmac, cutting through the acrid white smoke still drifting from the vents. The sheer volume of the descending rotors drowned out the ambient noise of the airfield, signaling the arrival of an overwhelming force. Outside on the concrete apron, Trenton Cross, who was still being escorted toward the outer perimeter by airport security, suddenly stopped. Seeing the distinct camouflage and the prestigious insignias of the high-level aerospace command, a desperate, malicious spark of hope returned to his eyes. He broke away from the airfield guards, rushing toward the landing pad, waving his arms frantically. The heavy hydraulic door of the military transport hissed open before the rotors had even completely stopped spinning. A towering figure stepped out into the blinding floodlights, General Braxton Hayes, a legendary four-star commander whose jurisdiction oversaw the nation's entire advanced defensive airspace network. Trenton intercepted him immediately, pointing a trembling, furious finger back toward the hangar doors. "General Hayes." "Thank God your division tracked the signal," Trenton shouted, trying to regain his billionaire composure. "A low-class criminal, a literal rideshare driver from the harbor, has violently breached a level 5 military encryption mainframe inside my facility. He's compromised proprietary government architecture. I demand you arrest him and Amelia Carter immediately for corporate espionage." General Hayes stopped. He looked down at Trenton Cross, his eyes cold, hard, and entirely unimpressed by the man's expensive tailored suit or his frantic corporate demands. "Mr. Cross," General Hayes said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that carried an unshakable military authority. "The only security liability I see on this tarmac is an arrogant civilian investor shouting in the middle of a secure operational zone. Step away from my men before I have you detained under a federal defense mandate." Without giving Trenton another glance, General Hayes marched past him, flanked by a disciplined detail of armored guards. He strode directly through the high steel doors of Hangar 7. Inside the command center, the 60 engineers stood in absolute, tense silence as the military presence filled the room. Amelia Carter instinctively stepped closer to her son, her hands gripping Oliver's shoulders. The cold, controlled CEO was completely gone. She was entirely vulnerable, her heart racing as she looked at the heavily armed guards. She had saved her company from a technical collapse, but she knew she was completely powerless against the absolute might of the federal government. She looked at Sebastian. He hadn't moved an inch. He stood completely relaxed beside the engineering console, his quiet masculinity acting as an unyielding shield of safety for everyone in the room. He wasn't flinching, and he wasn't afraid. General Hayes halted exactly 3 paces from the workbench. He scanned the stabilized diagnostic monitors, took in the pristine condition of the Vanguard prototype, and then looked directly at Sebastian. To the absolute shock of Amelia, Harrison Vance, and every technician in the facility, the legendary 4-star general snapped his hand upward, executing a flawless, deeply respectful military salute. "Chief Director Cole," General Hayes said, his voice ringing with profound emotional reverence. "The Pentagon Defense Grid flagged your personal override signature the exact microsecond it was entered. We deployed immediately. We should have known that only one man alive could have stabilized a runaway Aegis-class propulsion core from a civilian ground terminal." Sebastian slowly lowered his head in a respectful nod, his voice calm, level, and entirely unhurried. "General Hayes, it's been a long time." 5 years, Sebastian," the general said, his stern face softening into a genuine, deeply emotional smile. "The Joint Chiefs have spent every single day of those 5 years wishing you hadn't walked away. The specialized frameworks you built are the only reason our skies remain secure. When we saw your code re-engage tonight, we hoped you were coming back to us." Sebastian looked over at the bench. Chloe was sitting there, completely unfazed by the arrival of the military, holding Oliver's hand and pointing out a detail on her latest drawing. Sebastian looked back at the general, his dark eyes filled with absolute, unwavering certainty. "My retirement wasn't a temporary assignment, Braxton," Sebastian said softly, his voice carrying the immense weight of a father's devotion. "The day my wife passed, I made a covenant with my daughter. I promised her that the world would never come before her again. I don't build weapons anymore. I build a life for her. That's the only command structure that matters to me now." An absolute, breathless silence fell over the hangar. Amelia watched Sebastian, a deep, aching warmth flooding her chest. The contrast was beautiful. This man held the keys to the nation's highest defense infrastructure. He possessed a status that could command generals, yet he chose to drive a rideshare vehicle just to ensure his little girl felt safe, loved, and protected. General Hayes looked at Chloe, then back at Sebastian. He let out a slow, deeply respectful sigh and lowered his hand. I understand, Chief Director, and the President himself signed the decree granting you permanent civilian immunity. Your privacy remains absolute, but if the country ever faces a crisis that truly needs your mind, can I tell them the line is open? If it threatens the world my daughter walks in, General, Sebastian replied smoothly, I'll answer. General Hayes smiled, saluting once more. Fair enough, Sebastian. Enjoy your evening. He turned to his detail, his voice snapping back into command mode. Fall out! Secure the perimeter and clear the civilian investors from the airfield. We are departing. Within minutes, the military presence retreated, the heavy thumping of the helicopter fading into the night sky, leaving Hangar 7 in a peaceful, beautiful stillness. The public reversal was complete. The crowd of 60 engineers broke into a quiet, respectful applause, looking at Sebastian not just as a technical myth, but as a man of ultimate honor. Amelia walked over to him, her steps slow, her breathing finally deep and even. For the first time in 5 years, the constant, suffocating anxiety of her corporate life had completely dissolved. She looked at him, her eyes bright, with a rare, genuine tenderness. Senior Systems Architect of the Core Division, Amelia said softly, a beautiful smile gracing her lips. On your terms, your hours, no boardrooms, and I promise never to ask you to explain your choices. Sebastian looked down into her eyes, seeing the powerful executive who had finally found her peace. He offered a warm, quiet smile. I accept, Amelia. On one condition. Name it, she whispered. Every Thursday at 4 o'clock we stop working, Sebastian said, his voice full of quiet masculinity and warmth. We go to the bistro, we get a black coffee, a tea, 2 orange juices, and we help our kids draw wolves. Amelia's breath caught, a tear of pure happiness slipping down her cheek as she nodded. Deal. From the bench, Oliver held up the completed paper napkin, showing it to Harrison Vance and the remaining technicians with immense pride. In the corner, beside Chloe's neat signature, Oliver had written his own name under a perfectly drawn wolf. Sebastian walked over, picking up Chloe in his strong arms, while Amelia tightly held Oliver's hand. Together, the two families walked out of the massive hangar, stepping out into the crisp, quiet night air, moving away from the noise of the past and stepping forward into a beautiful, hopeful future together.